The sun was a hammer, and the dust of the coffin bend stockyards was the anvil. It rose in choking clouds, a gritty ochre fog that tasted of sweat, manure, and the finality of broken things. For Emmett Sloan, it was the taste of his own life. He leaned against a splintered rail, the wood hot enough to blister, and felt the last of his world bake away. Every face in the small, jeering crowd was a mirror reflecting his failure. The ranchers with their calloused hands and sun-cracked necks, the merchants in their sweat-stained hats, the bored drifters looking for a spectacle. They were all men who had held on. He was the man who had let go. His business, a freight company built with 10 years of his life's blood, was a ghost, its assets picked clean by creditors until nothing remained but rumors and debt. His wife, Sarah, had taken the children and gone back to her sisters in the East, her last letter a monument of quiet disappointment, each word a carefully placed stone on the grave of their marriage. There is nothing left for us here, Emmett. There is nothing left of you. He had read it until the paper disintegrated in his trembling hands. She wasn't wrong. He was a husk, a hollow man standing under a hostile sky with $2 silver in his pocket, the sum total of Emmett Sloan. The auctioneer, Ezekiel Marsh, was a nervous man, his body a collection of twitches and jerks held together by a cheap suit. He mopped his brow with a gray handkerchief, his voice a frantic bark that frayed at the edges. "All right, folks, settle down, settle down. We've got a fine selection today, prime stock for prime prices." Emmett watched without seeing, the parade of healthy cattle and strong horses a testament to a world he no longer belonged to. They were assets, investments, futures. He had only a past. He felt a phantom weight in his hand, the small, warm clasp of his daughter's fingers, and a wave of nausea so profound it almost buckled his knees. That was the wound that wouldn't scar over. The memory of her looking back at him from the carriage window, her expression not angry, but confused, as if she were trying to recognize the stranger her father had become. He was about to turn away, to walk into the desert, until his $2 and his life ran out, when Marsh's tone shifted. It lost its bluster, replaced by a note of pleading, of deep, unsettling anxiety. And now, for our final lot, a beast of burden, seasoned, very seasoned. 2-yard hands shoved a donkey onto the block. The crowd, which had been murmuring with interest, fell into a kind of contemptuous silence, punctuated by a few derisive chuckles. The animal was a portrait of decrepitude. It was old, its gray coat scoured and patched with the white marks of ancient scars. One ear drooped, torn halfway down its length. It favored its left foreleg, a subtle but persistent limp that spoke of a deep, unfixable injury. It stood with its head low, looking at nothing, the picture of a creature that had been worked to the edge of death and then pushed a little further. "What in God's name is that?" someone yelled from the back. "That's Marcus Webb's old jackass," another voice supplied, followed by a ripple of laughter. Heard it was still wandering the hills after the wolves got him. Marcus Webb. The name was a local legend, a ghost story whispered over campfires. A prospector who had struck a vein so rich it defied imagination, only to be betrayed and murdered for it, his mine lost to the wilderness. And this was his donkey, his relic. Marsh swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the crowd, not with the predatory glee of a salesman, but with the hunted look of prey. A loyal companion, knows the trails better than any man. A bargain for the discerning buyer. Who'll start the bidding? $5? Do I hear 5? The silence was his answer. It was thick and heavy with ridicule. No one wanted a half-dead, gimpy donkey that belonged to a ghost. It was bad luck incarnate. Emmett watched the animal. Amidst the jeers and the oppressive heat, the donkey lifted its head. For a fleeting second, its eyes, dark and improbably intelligent, met Emmett's. There was no despair in them, no plea. There was something else, a flicker of assessment, of deep, ancient knowing. It felt less like an animal looking at a man and more like a master craftsman inspecting a broken tool, wondering if it could be salvaged. $3? Marsh begged, his voice cracking. $2 to take this fine animal off my hands. It's a steal. The $2, the last two. Emmett's hand went to his pocket, the coin smooth and cool against his skin. It was an insane impulse, a final defiant act of madness in a life defined by poor decisions. Buying a worthless dying animal with the last of his money. It was a fitting end, a joke he could play on himself. He was buying his own epitaph. But it was the donkey's eyes that held him, that brief, impossible connection. An intelligence that didn't belong in this dusty, hopeless place. A resilience that he recognized, because it was the one thing, the single ember still glowing in the cold ashes of his own soul. $1! Marsh shrieked, his desperation now naked and alarming. He wasn't just trying to sell a donkey, he was trying to get rid of a curse. His eyes scanned the horizon, a nervous tick that spoke of a deeper fear. Emmett's voice was a rasp, a sound he barely recognized as his own. 2. The single word fell into the silence like a stone into a well. The crowd turned to stare at him, some with pity, most with scorn. The failed merchant buying a failed donkey. It was too perfect. Ezekiel Marsh's head snapped toward him, and the relief that washed over the auctioneer's face was so profound it was terrifying. It was the look of a man who had just seen the gallows torn down before his eyes. "Sold!" Marsh screamed, slamming his gavel down with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. "Sold to the gentleman for $2. Get him his animal. Get it done." The transaction was a blur. The coins left his palm, light as feathers, leaving him with nothing. A yard hand shoved a coarse rope into his hand, the other end tied around the donkey's neck. And then he was alone, standing in the middle of the yard with his purchase, the crowd already dispersing, moving on to more important things. Emmett looked at the donkey. The donkey looked back at him. The intelligent light in its eyes was still there, steady and unwavering. He had just spent everything he had on a broken-down animal named Chester, a living relic of a dead man's legend. He didn't know why. He only knew that in the depths of those dark, calm eyes, he had seen something he thought was gone forever, a reason to take the next step. As he tugged gently on the rope and led the limping donkey away from the auction block, he felt the weight of unseen eyes on his back, and a cold dread mingled with the first, fragile spark of an impossible hope. Ezekiel Marsh had not just been relieved, he had been terrified. And whatever he was afraid of, Emmett had just bought it for $2. The walk away from Coffin Bend was a slow, limping procession. Emmett didn't have a destination. He only had a direction, away from the town that had witnessed his ruin, away from the pity and the scorn. The desert stretched before them, a vast, indifferent canvas of baked earth and shimmering heat. Chester, the donkey, moved with a slow, rhythmic gait, his limp a steady, patient beat against the silence. For the first mile, Emmett was certain he had made the final, most pathetic mistake of a long and storied career in failure. The animal was old, hurt. It would likely walk a few more miles and then lie down to die, leaving Emmett truly and utterly alone. But as the town shrank to a dusty smudge on the horizon, a subtle change occurred. Chester's pace, while still slow, grew more confident. The limp seemed to lessen, the hesitation in his step replaced by a steady, ground-eating stride. His head came up, the one good ear swiveling, tasting the wind, reading the landscape with an expertise that was unnerving. This was not the broken, listless creature from the auction block. This was something else entirely. Emmett watched, his curiosity a fragile sprout in the barren soil of his despair. He had expected to be leading the animal, dragging it toward some unseen end. Instead, he found himself being led. When Emmett instinctively veered toward what looked like a flatter, easier path, Chester would resist, a stubborn planting of his hooves, a gentle but insistent pull of the rope in another direction. He led them through a maze of arroyos and rock formations that offered slivers of shade, a route that was longer but less exposed to the punishing sun. The donkey knew this land. It knew its secrets, its rhythms, its mercies. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the western sky, Chester stopped. He turned his head and looked at Emmett, a clear, unambiguous halt. He then nudged a flat, sheltered area tucked between three large boulders. The message was unmistakable. "We stop here for the night." Emmett was too tired and thirsty to argue. He had a small, nearly empty canteen and nothing else. No food, no bedroll, no fire. He had walked away from his life with only the clothes on his back and $2 that were now a gray donkey. He slumped to the ground, his back against a rock that was still warm from the day's heat. The silence of the desert descended, vast and absolute. It was a silence that echoed with his own emptiness. He thought of his children sleeping in a soft bed in a house far away, of Sarah reading them a story, their world safe and contained. The thought was a physical pain, a twisting in his gut so sharp he gasped. He buried his face in his hands, the grit of the day's dust scraping his skin. This was it, the end of the line. He would die out here, and his story would be nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered by the men who had laughed at him today. A soft, wet nudge against his arm startled him. He looked up. Chester was standing over him, his dark eyes soft with something that looked unnervingly like concern. The donkey nudged him again, more insistently this time, then turned and took a few steps away. He stopped and looked back, waiting. Emmett, confused, slowly got to his feet. What now? Chester walked to a patch of seemingly barren, rocky ground a few yards from their makeshift camp. He lowered his head, sniffed the earth, and then began to paw at the ground with his right forehoof, not the injured one. He scraped away the loose gravel with a deliberation that was utterly mesmerizing. It was not a random act, it was precise, methodical. After a few moments, his hoof struck something that wasn't stone. He scraped more vigorously, uncovering the edge of a flat, buried rock. He looked back at Emmett, a clear invitation in his gaze. Hesitantly, Emmett approached. He knelt down and, using his fingers, worked the flat rock free. It was heavy, and beneath it was a small, hollowed-out space. Inside lay an old oilskin packet. His heart began to pound, a frantic, hammering rhythm against his ribs. His hands trembled as he lifted the packet out. It was cool to the touch, tied shut with a leather thong. He fumbled with the knot, his fingers clumsy with a sudden wild surge of adrenaline. Inside was a small, hard biscuit of dried meat and fruit, pemmican, the long-lasting food of prospectors and hunters, and a tightly folded piece of paper. He devoured the pemmican without tasting it, the first real food he'd had in 2 days. It was dense and rich, and the strength it gave him was immediate. Then he unfolded the paper. In the fading light, he saw not words but a series of hand-drawn symbols, a square with a dot, a circle with a line through it, a triangle pointing down. It was a code. Below the symbols, someone had scrawled a single, frantic sentence. They know. He knows the code. Trust the beast. He knows the code. Chester. Emmett looked from the paper to the donkey, who was watching him with that same unnerving, intelligent calm. A treasure hunter's code, a hidden cache of food, a warning. This wasn't just an animal. It was a partner, a messenger, a living vessel for the secrets of his dead master, Marcus Webb. The thought was so staggering, so completely outside the realm of possibility, that Emmett almost laughed. Before he could fully process the madness of it all, another sound reached him. The distant rhythmic beat of hoof falls. More than one horse, riders coming fast. Chester's head snapped up, his one good ear swiveling like a compass needle, pointing back in the direction of Coffin Bend. He let out a low, guttural bray, a sound that was not of fear, but of alarm, a warning. Suddenly, Ezekiel Marsh's terror at the auction made perfect, horrifying sense. He hadn't been afraid of being stuck with an old donkey. He had been afraid of the men who were looking for it. And now they were coming. Emmett scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He looked out at the darkening horizon. He could see them now, 5 faint silhouettes against the dying light, moving with grim purpose. Dust clouds on the horizon, the recurring sign of approaching danger. He had a choice, a stark, brutal choice that presented itself with the speed of a striking snake. He could run, abandon the donkey and whatever mad secret it carried, and hope to lose himself in the night. Or he could stand with this creature, this intelligent, scarred, 4-legged mystery, and face whatever was coming. He looked at Chester. The donkey stood his ground, a solid, immovable silhouette, his gaze fixed on the approaching threat. He was not going to run. In that moment, Emmett's own past failures, the crushing weight of his despair, seemed to crystallize into a single point of cold, hard clarity. Running was what he had been doing his whole life. Running from responsibility, from confrontation, from the consequences of his own choices. It had led him here, to this patch of dirt, with nothing to his name. Standing still, fighting back. That was something new. He had bought this animal. He had entered into some unspoken contract. To run now would be the final act of a coward. He looked from the approaching riders to the donkey. He had trusted a flicker of intelligence in its eyes at an auction. Now he had to trust it with his life. He walked over and stood beside Chester, placing a hand on the donkey's coarse, scarred neck. The animal didn't flinch. It simply stood, a silent, resolute partner in the face of the oncoming storm. The secret map, the legacy of Marcus Webb, the reason for the hunt. He knew none of it yet. All he knew was that for the first time in a very long time, he was not alone. And the approaching darkness was no longer just an end, but a beginning. The 5 riders did not bother with caution. They thundered into the small clearing of boulders as if they owned the night, their horses snorting and stamping, kicking up stones and dust. They were shadows brought to life by the rising moon, broad-shouldered men wrapped in the casual menace of those who live by violence. Their faces were hard, obscured by low-brimmed hats and the arrogance of overwhelming force. One man, clearly the leader, spurred his horse forward until it loomed over Emmett. "That's far enough, old man," he growled, his voice like gravel grinding. "You've had your walk. We'll be taking the jackass now." Emmett's heart was a wild bird trapped in his chest, beating against his ribs until he thought they would crack. He kept his hand on Chester's neck, the coarse hair a strange anchor in a sea of terror. He could smell the stale sweat and cheap whiskey on the man. "I bought him, fair and square." The leader chuckled, a low, ugly sound. He shared a look with his men, who fanned out, creating a loose, inescapable circle. "You bought a problem, that's what you did. A problem that belongs to us. Now, give us the rope before you get hurt." Emmett's mind was a maelstrom of fear, but a cold, unfamiliar current ran beneath it. The note from the cache. Trust the beast. He looked at Chester. The donkey stood perfectly still, his head low, the picture of docile submission. He looked like the same worthless animal from the auction. Emmett swallowed, his throat dry as dust. He had to trust. "He's just an old donkey," Emmett said, his voice trembling slightly. "What could you possibly want with him?" "That's not your concern," the leader snapped, his patience wearing thin. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was a big man, his shadow swallowing Emmett whole. "Last time, the rope." He reached for it, and in that instant the world exploded. It was not the act of a simple beast of burden. It was the execution of a trained lethal maneuver. Chester, who had been standing with his head down, snapped it up with the force of a battering ram, catching the leader squarely under the chin. There was a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage, and the man went down like a sack of grain, a choked gurgle his only sound. Before the other riders could even register what had happened, Chester pivoted. The move was a blur of gray hide and coiled muscle. He wasn't limping now. He launched himself backwards, his rear hooves striking out with the precision of a master knife fighter. The iron-shod hooves connected with the chest of the nearest rider's horse. The horse screamed, a high, piercing sound of pain and terror, and collapsed sideways, pinning its rider's leg beneath it. Chester didn't pause. He spun, braying a sound that was not of fear, but of pure, unadulterated fury. It was a war cry. He charged the third rider, not with the clumsiness of a panicked animal, but with the focused intent of a predator. He ducked under the horse's neck and sank his powerful teeth into the rider's thigh. The man shrieked, a high, thin sound of agony, dropping his rifle as he tried to beat the donkey off him. The remaining two riders, finally shaking off their shock, drew their pistols. Muzzle flashes lit the clearing in strobing, hellish bursts. The air cracked with the sound of gunfire, but they were panicked, their shots wild. They were aiming at a donkey, but they were being attacked by a demon. Emmett, acting on pure instinct, dove behind one of the large boulders, the rock sparking as a stray bullet ricocheted off its surface. From his cover, he watched in stunned disbelief. Chester was a whirlwind of calculated violence. He released the screaming man's leg and charged the fourth rider. The man fired, the shot going wide as his horse shied violently. Chester reared up, his front hooves lashing out, striking the man in the shoulder and sending him tumbling from his saddle. Only one rider remained, his face a mask of pale terror in the moonlight. He stared at the carnage, one man down and unmoving, two writhing on the ground, one thrown from his horse, and then at the donkey, which now stood panting in the center of the clearing, its eyes burning with a ferocious light. The rider made his decision. He yanked his horse's reins, turning the terrified animal, and spurred it into a frantic gallop, fleeing back into the desert from which he'd come. Silence descended, broken only by the groans of the injured and the ragged, heaving breaths of the donkey. Emmett slowly rose from behind the boulder, his body shaking uncontrollably. The scene was surreal. 3 armed thugs, dispatched in less than a minute by an old limping donkey. He looked at Chester. The animal's fury seemed to drain away, replaced by a weary stillness. He walked over to Emmett, his limp more pronounced now, and nudged his hand, the gesture once again gentle, questioning. Emmett's gaze fell on Chester's flank. There, high on his left side, was a dark, wet patch matting the gray fur. Blood. One of the wild shots had found its mark. The adrenaline that had flooded Emmett's system turned to ice. They had won, but Chester was wounded. The immediate threat was gone, but the larger danger remained. The man who escaped would bring back more. They couldn't stay here. Emmett's mind, which had been a fog of despair only hours before, was now sharp, honed by terror and necessity. First, the wounded. He tore a long strip from the bottom of his own shirt, his hands still shaking. "Easy, boy," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Let me see." Chester stood perfectly still as Emmett gently probed the wound. It was a deep graze, a furrow plowed along the donkey's thick hide. The bullet had passed through, which was a mercy. It was bleeding freely but didn't seem to have hit bone. It needed to be cleaned. But there was something else. As his fingers explored the edges of the wound, he felt something hard and foreign beneath the skin. But it wasn't the bullet. It was a small, flat object, encased in what felt like stitched leather or oilskin. It was nestled deep in the muscle, an old healed-over secret that the fresh wound had partially exposed. His breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was the reason. The secret wasn't something Chester carried in a pack. It was something he was. A living vessel, a walking safe. With a surge of purpose, Emmett went to work. He searched the downed riders. The leader was dead, his neck broken. The other 2 were groaning, one with a crushed leg, the other with a savaged thigh. He ignored their pleas, his focus absolute. He found a flask of whiskey, a knife, and a small pouch of supplies containing a needle and coarse thread. It was everything he needed. He led Chester to the most sheltered part of the clearing. "This is going to hurt," he said softly, looking into the donkey's intelligent eyes. "But I have to do this. You have to trust me." Chester seemed to understand. He stood unmoving as Emmett poured the raw whiskey into the fresh wound. The donkey flinched, his muscles quivering, a low grunt escaping his throat, but he did not pull away. He held his ground. he trusted. With the clean blade of the rider's knife, Emmett made a careful, shallow incision, extending the bullet graze just enough to get his fingers around the hidden object. The process was a gruesome, intimate ballet of trust and pain. Emmett, the failed merchant, was now a battlefield surgeon, his patient a donkey who had just saved his life. He worked by the pale moonlight, sweat beading on his forehead, his own fear and exhaustion forgotten. Finally, he managed to work the small, blood-slicked packet free. It was an oilskin pouch, no bigger than his palm, stitched with incredible care directly into the animal's flesh, designed to become a part of him. He set the pouch aside and tended to the wound, cleaning it again, and then using the crude needle and thread to stitch the hide together. His stitches were clumsy, ugly, but they would hold. He used the last of the whiskey to clean his hands and the pouch. He then knelt, the small, heavy packet in his hand, and looked at Chester. The donkey watched him, his breathing still heavy, but his eyes were calm. The unspoken bond between them had been forged in shared violence and sealed in this act of mutual care. They were no longer just a man and a beast. They were partners. With trembling fingers, Emmett sliced open the stitches on the pouch. Inside, protected from the elements and the flesh of its bearer, was a map. It was drawn on a piece of treated hide, the lines fine and intricate. It was a map of canyons and rivers, of landmarks only a seasoned prospector would recognize, and in the center, nestled in a web of treacherous-looking mountains, was a symbol, a rough-drawn cathedral, its spire a mountain peak. Below it, 2 words were written in a confident, steady hand: La Catedral Perdida, the lost cathedral, and beside it, another note, the same script as the one in the cache. They killed me for this, but they will never find it. The beast knows the way. The fortress guards the throne. My revenge is my legacy. M. Webb Emmett Sloan, the bankrupt, the failure, the man with nothing, knelt in the dirt under a cold moon, surrounded by the wreckage of a gunfight. In his hands, he held a dead man's legacy and a map to a treasure of mythic proportions. His $2 purchase had just bought him a death sentence and a chance at a kingdom. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now joined by something new, something terrifying and exhilarating. Purpose. The man who escaped would be back, and not with 4 thugs, but with an army. The hunt had just begun. He looked at Chester, his partner, his guide, his protector. They had to move, and they had to move now. The desert at night was a different world, a landscape of silver and shadow. The oppressive heat of the day had bled out into the cosmos, leaving a chill that seeped into Emmett's bones. He walked, leading a still limping Chester, not away from the site of the attack, but parallel to the trail, using the broken rocky ground to mask their tracks. Every snapped twig, every dislodged stone sounded like a gunshot in the profound silence. Fear was a constant companion, a cold presence at his back. The rider who had escaped was a promise of retribution, a guarantee that the sun would rise on a new, more dangerous hunt. Emmett's mind, once sluggish with despair, was now a furnace of frantic activity. He replayed the words from the map, the note from the cache. The beast knows the way. The fortress guards the throne. Marcus Webb had not just found a mine, he had created a system, a network of secrets with Chester at its heart. The donkey was not just a map, he was the key. For 2 days they traveled, moving mostly at night and resting during the brutal heat of the day in whatever sliver of shade they could find. Emmett learned to read the subtle language of his partner. A swiveling ear, a hesitation in his step, a soft nudge. Each was a communication. Chester led them away from open ground, toward game trails and dry creek beds that hid them from view. He found water twice, hidden seeps, that Emmett would have walked past without a second glance, pawing at the damp earth until a small puddle collected. He was a survivalist, a veteran of this wilderness, and Emmett was his apprentice. The map was seared into Emmett's memory. He studied it in stolen moments, trying to align the cryptic drawings with the landscape around him. He was a merchant, a man of ledgers and contracts, not a frontiersman. But desperation was a powerful teacher. He learned to read the sun, to gauge distances, to feel the subtle shifts in the land that signaled an ascent or a canyon. On the morning of the third day, the horizon delivered on its promise. Far behind them, maybe 10 miles distant, a plume of dust rose against the pale blue sky. It was larger than the dust cloud of a few riders. It was a column, thick and deliberate, a professional team, trackers, men who would not be dispatched by a surprising donkey and a stroke of luck. They were being hunted by a superior force. Chester saw it too. He stopped, his body rigid, his good ear locked in the direction of the dust cloud. A low rumble vibrated in his chest. Emmett felt a fresh wave of cold dread. They could not outrun them in the open, not with Chester's limp, which had returned with a vengeance after the fight. They needed a sanctuary. It was then that Chester made a decisive turn. He veered sharply from their northward path, heading northeast into a series of rising, broken foothills that looked like the shattered teeth of some ancient beast. The terrain grew more difficult, the ground a treacherous scree of loose rock and thorny brush. It was a place no one would go by choice, but Chester moved with purpose, his limp a painful but steady rhythm. He knew this place. He was leading them somewhere specific. Hours later, as the sun climbed toward its zenith, they found it. Tucked into a narrow, hidden canyon was a collection of crumbling adobe walls and rotting timbers, the ruins of an old, abandoned mining camp. It was a ghost town, a monument to some long-forgotten bust. To Emmett, it looked like a trap, a place to be cornered. But Chester walked into it without hesitation, leading him toward the most intact structure, a small, windowless shack that had once been an assay office. Chester stopped at the door and pawed at the ground, 3 sharp, distinct scrapes. The code. Emmett's heart hammered. He pushed the rickety door open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. But in the center of the room, one of the floorboards looked different, its edges cleaner, the wood a slightly different shade. Marcus Webb's sanctuary. Using the knife he'd taken from the dead rider, Emmett pried the board loose. Beneath it was a small, rock-lined hollow, and inside that hollow lay a miracle. There was a leather-bound journal, a canvas sack heavy with the unmistakable weight of gold, and another oilskin packet of pemmican. Emmett sank back on his heels, his breath catching in his throat. He opened the sack first. It was filled with raw, lumpy gold nuggets, some as small as a pea, others as large as his thumb. It was more wealth than he had ever held in his life. For a moment, a dizzying vision of escape filled his mind. He could take the gold, leave the donkey and disappear, buy passage on a ship, start a new life somewhere no one knew his name. But the vision faded as quickly as it came. He looked at Chester, who stood patiently in the doorway, his flank crudely stitched, his body a testament to loyalty and shared violence. He looked at the journal. This wasn't just about gold. That was the lure, not the prize. The rider who escaped, the men who sent him, they wouldn't stop. They didn't just want the gold. They wanted the source. They wanted the mine. To run with this sack of nuggets would be to sign his own death warrant. He would be hunted for the rest of his short life. His purpose, his only path to survival, lay forward, not back. It lay in following Webb's plan to its conclusion. He opened the journal. Webb's handwriting was clear and strong, the writing of a brilliant, methodical mind. It wasn't just a diary, it was a manual. It detailed the betrayal by his partners, men of wealth and influence from the East who had tried to steal his discovery. It detailed his preparations for the inevitable conflict, this network of caches, the training of his loyal donkey. He described Chester not as a pet, but as his adjutant, his most trusted soldier. They think in terms of wealth, Webb had written. They understand greed. They will follow the glitter. But they do not understand the stone. The true power is not in the gold, but in the mountain that births it. It is a fortress, a kingdom waiting for a king. Use their greed against them. Use their greed against them. The words resonated in Emmett's mind, a posthumous piece of strategic advice from a man he was coming to know better than any living soul. He looked at the sack of gold. It was not his salvation, it was his weapon. A new sound reached him from the mouth of the canyon, the clatter of a horse on rock, followed by a sharp whistle. The trackers were here. They were spreading out, sweeping the foothills. They would find this place soon. Time had run out. A plan, desperate and brilliant, bloomed in Emmett's mind, a plan worthy of Marcus Webb. He took the heavy sack of gold nuggets. He left the journal. He had read enough. He knew what he had to do. He went back to the entrance of the canyon, his heart pounding a rhythm of terror and resolve. He found what he was looking for, a narrow game trail that led up the steep canyon wall, away from the ruins. It was a treacherous path, but it led toward the high mountains depicted on the map. He returned to Chester. "It's time to go, partner," he whispered, his voice steady. "But we need to give them something to follow." He led Chester 100 yards down the main trail leading away from the ruins, toward an open stretch of desert. There, in the dust, he poured out the gold. The nuggets glittered in the harsh sunlight, a flagrant, impossible trail of wealth. He used his boot to scuff the tracks, to make it look as if someone had dropped the bag in a panicked flight, spilling its contents. It was a perfect decoy, an irresistible lure for greedy men. It screamed of a fool who had struck it rich and was now running scared. They would stop. They would gather every last speck. It would buy him time. He then carefully led Chester back, walking them both backward in their own tracks to the point where the game trail branched off, and then scrambled up the steep incline, leaving the canyon floor behind. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could already imagine the scene. The professional trackers, so focused on their hunt, brought to a sudden, avaricious halt by the sight of raw gold lying in the dust. He had used the treasure to save the map. He had used the past to secure the future. He was no longer Emmett Sloan, the failed merchant. He was Marcus Webb's successor. As he and Chester climbed higher into the unforgiving mountains, moving toward the lost cathedral, he was no longer running from a threat. He was moving toward his throne. The mountains were a different kind of trial. The desert had been a furnace, an open expanse that tested their endurance. The mountains were a labyrinth, a vertical world of stone and sky that tested their will. The game trail Webb had used was barely a trail at all, more a suggestion of passage etched into the cliff faces. It was a path for goats and madmen, and for a donkey who knew the way. Chester, despite his wound and the punishing climb, moved with a new kind of energy. This was his home ground. Every switchback, every narrow ledge, every seemingly impassable rockfall was familiar to him. He was the living memory of this terrain, and Emmett followed him without question. There were times when the path dwindled to a ledge barely wider than Emmett's boots, with a sheer drop of 1,000 feet to one side. In those moments, Emmett would close his eyes, place his hand on Chester's flank, and walk, trusting the animal's footing more than his own. The bond between them had transcended language. It was a fusion of instinct and intellect, a partnership perfected in the crucible of survival. They climbed for a day, and then another. The air grew thin and cold. The world below, the world of hunters and hunted, shrank into an abstraction of browns and reds. Up here, there was only the wind, the rock, and the immense silent indifference of the peaks. Emmett's old life, the ledgers, the angry letters from creditors, the hollow ache of his family's absence, it all felt like a story that had happened to someone else. The man who had trembled at the auction block was gone, scoured away by fear and sun and a terrible, clarifying purpose. The man who remained was leaner, harder, his eyes accustomed to judging distances and scanning for threats. He was a creature of the mountain now, as much as Chester was. He thought of Marcus Webb. He pictured him on these same ledges, a brilliant, lonely man, planning his revenge, building his fortress, placing his faith not in other men who had betrayed him, but in the unshakable loyalty of an animal and the enduring strength of the earth itself. Emmett was not just following a map. He was completing a pilgrimage. He was fulfilling a dead man's promise. On the third morning in the mountains, they rounded a massive granite buttress, and the landscape opened up before them. Emmett stopped, his breath catching not from the altitude, but from awe. Below them lay a hidden valley, a perfect bowl of impossible green nestled in the heart of the stone wilderness. A stream, fed by the high snows, snaked through its center, and a grove of hardy pines clung to the valley floor. It was a secret garden, a paradise hidden from the world. But it was what rose from the far side of the valley that stole his voice. It wasn't a mine in the conventional sense, a crude hole dug into a hillside. The entrance was a vast natural archway in the cliff face, shaped by millennia of wind and water, into a form that uncannily resembled the nave of a great cathedral. Two towering pillars of rock stood like spires on either side of the entrance. La Catedral Perdida, the lost cathedral. It was real, and guarding it, overlooking the entire valley and the only pass that led into it, was the fortress. It wasn't a castle of hewn stone and mortar, but a natural formation, a massive mesa that rose from the valley floor like a king's throne. Its flat top was a perfect strategic vantage point, its sheer cliffs an impassable defense. The fortress guards the throne. Webb hadn't just found a gold mine, he had found a kingdom, complete with its own cathedral and its own impregnable citadel. Chester let out a soft, contented bray. He had brought his master's successor home. He walked down the gentle slope into the valley, his limp almost gone, and began to graze on the rich grass near the stream, his journey over. Emmett followed slowly, his mind struggling to comprehend the scale of what he was seeing. This was the source. This was the engine of wealth and power that men had killed for. He walked to the entrance of the mine. The air that flowed out was cool and smelled of damp earth and ozone and something else, the faint, metallic tang of gold. The walls of the archway glittered, shot through with thick, milky white veins of quartz, and running through the quartz were brilliant, breathtaking seams of pure gold, as thick as his arm. It wasn't a vein. It was a mother lode. It was the heart of the mountain. He stood there for a long time, not moving, simply breathing. The frantic energy of the chase, the gnawing fear, the desperate struggle for survival, it all washed away, replaced by a profound, bone-deep stillness. It was the feeling of arrival, but it was not an end. The gold glittering in the rock was not the treasure. It was just the treasury. The real treasure was the valley itself, the water, the defensibility, the isolation, the fortress. He turned and looked back the way he had come, his gaze traveling up the pass, across the jagged peaks, and out toward the distant hazy expanse of the desert. He was no longer looking at it as a hunted man searching for an escape route. He was looking at it as a king surveys his domain. Out there were the men who had hunted him, the partners who had betrayed Webb, the entire grasping, greedy world. They could have their dust and their fury. They could fight over the glittering crumbs he had left them. From here, from this throne of rock and sky, he could build. Not a freight business built on debt and hope, but an empire built on a foundation of solid gold and unbreachable stone. He could be a ghost, a myth, a hidden power who could pull the strings of the territories without ever being seen. He could build something that would last, something for the family he had lost, not to win them back, but to prove to the ghost of his former self that he was not a failure. He had just needed a different kind of challenge, an impossible one. Chester ambled over and stood beside him, nudging his hand gently. Emmett looked down at the old, scarred donkey, his partner, his savior, the keeper of secrets. The two of them, a broken man and a worthless animal, had outwitted and outlasted them all. They had been forged into something new in the fires of the desert. He placed his hand on Chester's neck, the gesture now as familiar as breathing. The sun was warm on his face, and the wind whispered through the pines. It was the sound of hard-earned peace. A quiet understanding passed between them. The journey was over. The work was about to begin.